A shattered man trades his last $18,000 for a rotting Appalachian shack, seeking only a quiet place to disappear. Instead, beneath 80 years of dust and splintered oak, he unearths a chilling conspiracy, millions in forgotten currency, and a deadly secret someone is still hunting for today. Arthur Gable did not lose his life in a dramatic explosion or a tragic accident. He lost it in a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a Denver high-rise. At 44 years old, Arthur was the founder of Apex Logistics, a mid-sized freight routing company he had built from the ground up over 15 grueling years. He had poured every ounce of his energy, every weekend, and every dollar of his personal credit into making it a success. But business, much like nature, is entirely unforgiving to the blind. His blindness came in the form of Richard Croft. Richard was Arthur's chief financial officer, his college roommate at Colorado State, and the man who stood as best man at his wedding. For 3 years, behind a smoke screen of complex corporate restructuring and aggressive offshore tax strategies, Richard had been quietly bleeding Apex Logistics dry. By the time the auditors from Deloitte caught the irregularities, Richard had leveraged the company's assets to secure a massive loan from Vanguard Capital, siphoned the funds into untouchable shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and vanished. Because Arthur had personally guaranteed the corporate loans, a fatal mistake made out of blind trust, the collapse did not just bankrupt his company, it obliterated his personal life. The legal fallout was swift and merciless. Wells Fargo seized his accounts. The bank foreclosed on his sprawling modern home in Cherry Creek. His wife of 12 years, Jessica, who had grown accustomed to country club dinners and winter vacations in Aspen, filed for divorce the day the foreclosure notice was taped to their front door. She didn't leave a malicious note, just a sterile text message from her lawyer's office informing Arthur she was moving back to Seattle with her parents. In a matter of 6 months, Arthur went from a respected CEO with a net worth of over $8 million to a pariah sleeping on a stained mattress in a cheap motel in Aurora. His entire existence was reduced to 2 cardboard boxes of clothes, a beat-up 2004 Ford F-150 with a slipping transmission, and a checking account balance of exactly $18,422. Depression threatened to swallow him whole. The Rocky Mountains, which had once felt like a majestic backdrop to his success, now felt like prison walls mocking his failure. He needed to run. He needed a place where no one knew the name Arthur Gable, where the humiliating pity in the eyes of his former peers couldn't reach him. Late one night, illuminated only by the harsh, flickering glow of a cheap laptop screen, Arthur scoured online county tax deed auctions. He wasn't looking for an investment. He was looking for a tomb, a place to hide. He found it in Oconee County, South Carolina, deep in the dense, humid foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The listing was accompanied by 3 grainy photographs. It was a 1920s timber cabin sitting on 5 acres of heavily wooded land at the end of a forgotten dirt road called Whisper Ridge. The property had been abandoned for over a decade, tangled in a complicated web of intestate succession and unpaid property taxes following the death of its previous owner, an eccentric recluse named Elias Thorne, a local name the listing noted, but Arthur paid no mind to the history. The opening bid was $15,000. With trembling fingers, Arthur placed a bid for $16,000. 3 days later, the county emailed him the deed. The cross-country drive was a blur of cheap coffee, rest-stop bathrooms, and the relentless, grinding hum of truck tires on asphalt. When Arthur finally turned off the paved highway onto Whisper Ridge, the dense canopy of ancient oak and pine trees immediately blocked out the afternoon sun, plunging the dirt road into a permanent, damp twilight. When the cabin finally came into view, Arthur killed the truck's engine and just stared through the cracked windshield. The photographs had been generous. The reality was a nightmare of neglect. The cabin was a rotting, asymmetrical structure that looked as though the surrounding forest was actively trying to swallow it whole. Thick, serpentine vines of kudzu choked the front porch, pulling the wooden pillars off their stone foundations. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, missing hundreds of cedar shingles like knocked-out teeth. The windows were entirely blown out, leaving dark, gaping holes that stared back at him like hollow eyes. Stepping out of the truck, the heavy, humid South Carolina air hit him like a physical blow. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of cicadas and the distant, mournful cry of a crow. Arthur unlocked the heavy padlock he had brought, only to find the front door's hinges were completely rusted through. He had to kick the door to force it open, sending a cloud of toxic-smelling dust and mold spores into the air. The interior was a disaster. The floorboards were slick with years of accumulated moisture, covered in a carpet of dead leaves, animal droppings, and broken glass. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a potent mixture of rotting pine, wet earth, and raccoon urine. In the center of the main room stood a massive stone fireplace, the only part of the structure that looked like it hadn't surrendered to time. That first night, a torrential Appalachian thunderstorm rolled over the ridge. Arthur huddled in his sleeping bag in the driest corner of the room, listening to the rain pour through the gaping holes in the roof, pooling on the warped floorboards. The wind howled through the shattered windows, creating an eerie, whistling symphony that sounded almost human. Shivering in the dark, clutching a cold can of baked beans, Arthur wept. He wept for his lost company, for Jessica, for the comfortable life that had been snatched away from him. He had hit rock bottom, but when the morning sun finally broke through the dense canopy, casting long, golden shafts of light across the ruined floor, something inside Arthur shifted. He looked at the peeling wallpaper, the rotting wood, the overwhelming decay. He realized that this cabin was exactly like him, broken, abandoned, and stripped of all dignity. If he let it rot, he would rot with it. But if he could somehow rebuild this structure with his own two hands, maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild himself. Months bled into one another as winter slowly yielded to the sweltering, unforgiving heat of a southern spring. Arthur transformed his grief into a brutal, punishing physical routine. He woke up at dawn every day, subsisting on cheap oatmeal and black coffee brewed over an open fire, before dedicating 14 hours to grueling manual labor. His remaining $2,000 was stretched to its absolute breaking point at a local Home Depot in the nearby town of Seneca. He bought heavy-duty tarps, essential hand tools, screws, bleach, and a small generator. Because he couldn't afford professional timber, he scavenged usable wood from fallen trees on the property, teaching himself basic carpentry through trial and error. His hands, once soft and manicured from years of typing emails and shaking hands at corporate galas, were now covered in thick, yellowish calluses, permanent dirt, and deep cuts. His waistline shrank, the expensive tailored suits of his past replaced by sweat-stained t-shirts and heavy denim jeans. The agonizing physical pain in his back and shoulders became a strange comfort. It was a pain he had earned, a pain that grounded him in reality, entirely unlike the abstract, suffocating agony of financial ruin. By late May, Arthur had successfully tarped the roof, cleared out the waist-high debris from the interior, and scrubbed the stone fireplace clean of decades of soot. The next major project was the most daunting, replacing the structural floorboards in the main living area. The original floor was made of massive, wide plank oak boards. Near the front door, water damage had turned the wood into a spongy, hazardous mess. But near the massive stone fireplace, the wood was still dense and hard, though deeply warped by time. Arthur decided to tear it all out to check the joists underneath, a necessary step before laying down cheap plywood subflooring. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the air thick with humidity and the smell of ozone from an approaching storm. Arthur was on his hands and knees, covered in sweat and sawdust, using a heavy iron crowbar to pry up the oak planks. The rusted iron nails screamed in protest as they were violently ripped from the floor joists. He was working his way toward the hearth of the stone fireplace when the crowbar snagged. Arthur grunted, putting his entire body weight onto the iron bar, expecting the wood to splinter. Instead, he heard a sharp, metallic clink. Frowning, Arthur wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his filthy forearm. He grabbed a flashlight and aimed it into the narrow gap between the planks. Underneath a thick, compacted layer of grey dust and ancient spider webs, something dark and metallic caught the light. Curiosity overriding his exhaustion, Arthur grabbed his hammer and aggressively smashed the adjacent rotted plank, splintering the wood until he could rip it away with his bare, gloved hands. He froze. Embedded flush into a thick piece of subflooring, entirely hidden by the overlaid oak planks, was a massive, rusted iron ring. It was attached to a perfectly square cut of wood, measuring about 3 feet by 3 feet. It wasn't just a loose board. It was a heavy, deliberate trapdoor. Arthur's heart began to hammer against his ribs. The county records had been explicit. The property was a simple, single-story cabin, resting on a shallow dirt crawl space. There was absolutely no mention of a basement or a root cellar. Furthermore, the way the floorboards had been laid over the trapdoor indicated that whoever hid it never intended for it to be found again. The nails holding the covering planks were old, square-cut iron, suggesting this door hadn't seen the light of day in at least 50 years. Adrenaline surging, Arthur grabbed a wire brush and furiously scrubbed the rust and hardened dirt away from the iron ring. It took him 20 minutes of violent tugging, wedging the crowbar into the microscopic seam of the trapdoor to break the vacuum seal of time and decay. With a final agonizing heave, the heavy wooden square broke free, groaning as it swung upward on hidden, heavy-duty brass hinges. A rush of air hit Arthur's face. He flinched, expecting the overwhelming stench of damp earth, black mold, or perhaps the horrifying smell of a shallow grave. Instead, the air rising from the black square was startlingly dry and smelled faintly of machine oil, old paper, and stale tobacco. Arthur grabbed his heavy-duty maglite, switched on the powerful LED beam, and pointed it down into the abyss. A sturdy, surprisingly well-crafted wooden staircase descended into the darkness. But what caught Arthur's breath was the construction of the walls below. They weren't made of dirt or the uneven fieldstone of the cabin's foundation. They were perfectly stacked, modern cinder blocks, completely dry and reinforced with steel rebar. Someone had secretly excavated a massive, structurally sound subterranean room directly beneath the cabin. "What the hell?" Arthur whispered aloud, the sound of his own voice startling him in the empty cabin. He hesitated. Every rational instinct told him to put the door back, call the Oconee County Sheriff, and walk away. But he had nothing left to lose. He was a man who had been stripped of everything. Fear had long since been replaced by a numb, reckless apathy. Gripping the flashlight like a weapon, Arthur slowly descended the stairs, the old wood creaking in protest under his weight. At the bottom, he found a room roughly the size of the cabin above it, entirely shielded from the moisture of the Appalachian soil. The beam of his flashlight swept across the space, revealing a scene that defied all logic. Stacked neatly against the far wall were over 24 olive-drab, military-style metal crates. In the center of the room sat a massive antique Mosler double-door safe, its black paint chipped but undeniably formidable. Resting on top of a makeshift wooden workbench to his right were several heavy, dark canvas duffel bags, a row of glass jars filled with what looked like desiccated silica gel packets to absorb moisture, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. Arthur approached the workbench, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He reached out and touched one of the canvas bags. The fabric was stiff but intact. The zipper was heavily oxidized. With a hard yank, he broke the zipper free, tearing the fabric slightly. Arthur directed the flashlight into the open bag. His breath hitched in his throat, and the heavy maglite nearly slipped from his trembling fingers. Inside the bag, bound in dry, brittle rubber bands that snapped instantly upon contact, were stacks of United States currency. Not singles or 20s. They were tightly packed, uncirculated $100 bills. Panic and euphoria warred in Arthur's chest. He reached in, pulling out a stack. He expected them to be counterfeit, perhaps movie props. He held one up to the light, checking for watermarks. They were old, the small portrait hundreds printed before the late 90s redesign. But they were undeniably, terrifyingly real. There had to be at least $500,000 in this bag alone, and there were 6 bags on the table. Trembling, Arthur set the money down and turned to the leather-bound ledger. He cracked it open. The pages were filled with meticulous, hand-written accounting, columns of dates, massive dollar amounts, and routing numbers. As his eyes scanned the entries, a profound chill washed over him. The dates didn't match the dust. The earliest entries were from 1997, referencing offshore accounts in the Bahamas. But it was a specific notation in the margins that made Arthur's blood run cold. Wachovia Internal Transfer, Miami Branch, cleared. Arthur recognized that name and the context. During his time building his logistics empire, he had followed financial news religiously. In 2010, Wachovia Bank had settled for over $100 million after federal investigators discovered they had knowingly laundered billions of dollars for violently ruthless international drug cartels. This wasn't just old mob money or a forgotten bootlegger's stash. This was cartel money, blood money, dark money, tied to a massive systemic laundering operation. Arthur stumbled backward, bumping into the heavy Mosler safe. The reality of what he had found was crashing down on him. If this money belonged to the people who ran those operations, they did not forget about lost assets. He needed to cover the trap door. He needed to pack his truck and leave South Carolina tonight. But as Arthur turned to rush back up the wooden stairs, the beam of his flashlight caught something completely out of place, resting on the bottom step. It was a small, crumpled piece of white paper. Arthur knelt, his hands shaking violently as he picked it up and smoothed it out. It was a printed receipt from an Exxon gas station located out on the main highway in Seneca. The ink was still dark, crisp, and fresh. Arthur looked at the date printed at the top of the receipt. It wasn't from 50 years ago. It wasn't from 1997. The receipt was dated exactly 12 days ago. Arthur was not alone, and the owner of the cellar was coming back. The crisp, white Exxon receipt slipped from Arthur's trembling fingers, fluttering like a dead leaf onto the wooden stairs. 12 days. Whoever this vault belonged to hadn't forgotten it. They were actively using it. The air in the cellar, previously cool and preserved, suddenly felt suffocatingly tight. Before Arthur could process the full gravity of his discovery, a sound shattered the heavy silence of the Appalachian afternoon. It was the distinct, rhythmic crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel and packed dirt of Whisper Ridge. Panic, primal and blinding, seized him. He scrambled back up the wooden stairs, his mind racing through a disjointed loop of survival instincts. He had to cover the trap door. He had to run. But as his head breached the floorboards and he looked out through the shattered windows of the cabin, he realized it was already too late. A sleek, mud-splattered black Chevrolet Tahoe was aggressively braking in front of the rotting porch, cutting off the only exit path for his beat-up Ford F-150. Arthur ducked below the window line, his heart slamming against his ribs so violently it bruised his chest. He backed away from the open trapdoor, seeking refuge in the darkest corner of the cabin, squeezing himself behind the massive stone fireplace. He dragged a heavy, mouldering tarp over his legs, holding his breath as he peered through a narrow gap in the stonework. 2 doors slammed shut. Heavy boots crunched on the dead leaves outside. "I told you the county issued a tax deed, you idiot," a sharp, furious voice echoed through the damp air. "I pay you to monitor the Oconee properties. How does a shell company default on $200 in property taxes?" Arthur froze. His blood turned to ice in his veins. He knew that voice. He had listened to that voice present quarterly earnings reports, pitch venture capitalists, and toast at his own wedding. It was Richard Croft. Through the crack in the stone, Arthur watched in absolute disbelief as his former chief financial officer, the man who had destroyed his life, stolen his company, and vanished with millions, stepped onto the rotting porch. Richard looked different. Gone were the tailored Armani suits and the slicked-back hair. He wore tactical outdoor gear, a heavy jacket, and a neatly trimmed beard, looking every bit the rugged survivalist. Behind him walked a heavily built man carrying a suppressed matte black tactical rifle slung across his chest. "The lawyer in Charleston screwed up the LLC filings, Mr. Croft," the armed man replied, his tone defensive. "But look at the place. The new owner drove a piece of junk truck here and started ripping up wood. He's a nobody. We pack the bags, put 2 in the back of his head, and bury him in the woods. Problem solved." The reality of the conspiracy clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Richard hadn't just embezzled Apex Logistics funds. He had been laundering money for a much larger, darker syndicate, likely using Arthur's freight routes to move illicit cash. When the auditors closed in, Richard liquidated everything into offshore accounts and physical cash, hiding this specific stash in a property held by one of his untraceable shell companies. They stepped into the main room of the cabin. Arthur pressed his back against the rough, cold stone, squeezing his eyes shut. "He found it," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he stared at the exposed subflooring. "Where is he?" the armed man asked, the metallic clack of a rifle safety disengaging echoing loudly in the empty room. "Who cares? He's probably out back taking a leak or scavenging wood," Richard snapped impatiently. "Get down there. Grab the main ledger and as many duffels as you can carry in one trip. We burn the rest, and we burn the cabin. If the Paul LaRue syndicate finds out this drophouse was compromised by a tax auction, they will skin us both alive." Paul LaRue. The name sent a jolt of pure terror through Arthur. He was a real-life transnational crime boss, a ruthless cartel innovator who left trails of bodies across 4 continents. Richard was playing in a league of monsters. "Move!" Richard barked. The heavy footsteps approached the center of the room. Arthur heard the creak of the wooden stairs as the armed man descended into the cellar. A moment later, Richard followed, muttering curses about incompetent lawyers and backwoods counties. This was it. Arthur's moment of execution, or his moment of salvation. As soon as Richard's head disappeared beneath the floor line, a strange, terrifying calm washed over Arthur. He was no longer the broken, defeated man sleeping in a cheap Aurora motel. He was a phantom who had already lost everything. Arthur slipped out from behind the fireplace, completely silent on his bare, stockinged feet, having kicked off his heavy boots to avoid making a sound. He crept toward the open trapdoor. Below, the beams of their flashlights danced across the cinder-block walls. "Grab that bag. Check the Mosler for the backup drives," Richard's voice echoed upward, slightly muffled by the depth of the cellar. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor with both hands and threw his entire body weight backward. The heavy wooden square slammed shut with a thunderous, concussive boom that shook dust from the rafters. Immediately, Arthur grabbed his heavy iron crowbar and jammed it horizontally through the thick brass handles of the trapdoor's latch system, wedging it tightly beneath the adjacent, still intact oak floorboards. It was a perfect makeshift deadbolt. "Hey!" Richard screamed from below, pounding on the underside of the heavy wood. "Hey! Open this door!" A muffled gunshot rang out, the bullet failing to penetrate the thick, reinforced wood and heavy iron plating of the trapdoor. Arthur didn't stop moving. Adrenaline fueled his muscles with superhuman strength. He dragged the heavy cast-iron wood stove, a rusted behemoth weighing easily 300 pounds, across the slick floor, groaning with effort, and parked it directly on top of the trapdoor. "Arthur?" Richard's voice drifted up, suddenly laced with a creeping, desperate realization as he recognized the grunt of effort. "Arthur, is that you? Listen to me. We can make a deal." Arthur stood over the trapdoor, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. He looked down at the wood, feeling the frantic vibrations of the men trapped below. He didn't say a word. He owed Richard Croft nothing, least of all a conversation. Instead, Arthur grabbed his keys, sprinted out the front door, and jumped into his battered Ford F-150. The engine roared to life on the first turn, protesting loudly as he threw it into reverse, navigated around the cartel's Tahoe, and tore down the dirt road of Whisper Ridge, leaving a cloud of thick southern dust in his wake. He didn't stop driving until he reached a bustling, brightly lit truck stop just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Sitting in a vinyl booth with a black coffee, Arthur pulled out a burner phone he bought from the convenience store. He didn't call the local police. Local cops could be bought, or worse, outgunned by the network Richard was tied to. He called the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division, specifically asking to speak with an agent regarding the ongoing international asset recovery of Paul LaRue's network. When the agent finally got on the line, skeptical and impatient, Arthur laid out his leverage with corporate precision. The location. He provided the exact coordinates of the Whisper Ridge cabin and the hidden subterranean bunker. The prisoners. He identified Richard Croft, detailing his role in laundering money through Apex Logistics to offshore accounts. The evidence. He detailed the physical presence of millions in uncirculated currency, the Mosler safe, and the comprehensive ledger tying it all together. Arthur officially invoked his rights under the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC whistleblower program, which legally entitled him to between 10 and 30% of the total monetary sanctions collected from the bust. Within 4 hours, an FBI hostage rescue team, flanked by FinCN investigators, raided the Whisper Ridge cabin. They found the heavy iron trapdoor exactly as Arthur left it. Below, they found a terrified Richard Croft, millions in illicit cash, and the ledger that would ultimately dismantle a massive arm of an international syndicate. Arthur Gable never returned to the corporate world of Denver. 9 months later, the federal government transferred a wire for just over $4 million into a secure trust in his name, his legal whistleblower reward. He used a small fraction of it to buy a quiet, isolated piece of land on the rugged coast of Maine. He built a small, sturdy cabin from scratch, leaving no basement, no hidden spaces, and no room for the ghosts of his past to ever hide again. If you found this story of betrayal, survival, and ultimate revenge thrilling, please hit that like button, drop a comment, sharing your favorite plot twist, and subscribe to the channel. We bring you brand new, heart-pounding stories every single week, and your support helps us uncover even more incredible mysteries. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.